Okay, this is lecture number 9. Um, and it's another book that I assigned you to buy called The Hacking of the American Mind. And we will read this whole book. The other two books, we will read parts of the book. Um, all right, so this book is all about the food system and how corporations have taken hold of our global food system and how much damage it's doing to the human body. So far, with social media, okay, with Mr. Mate, he said it's a toxic culture and the profit motive corporations have controlled our culture and it's become toxic. His main thing is mental health and stress. Um, Again, the Greeks had a view of the mind, a view of childhood habituation, which is very much a response to this because it's the opposite. The way you treat your kids, the way you raise your kids is just what Mr. Height says. They go outside, play, they stay active, they interact with other kids, they have their ups and downs. They learn how to live by living, not by being on a phone or being on TV was the previous generation. Um, so we had Mate, toxic culture, we had social media, and now that was how it screwed up with your brain stem and your emotions and your social relations. Um, this is about your body and how the system screws up your body chemistry, your metabolism. So 80% of Americans over age 50 have a metabolic disorder. And so you will read about, or hopefully you have read about the body chemistry behind these disorders. And um, it's really bad. Like I know people who have these disorders, and just because of the body chemistry, they are hungry, even, you know, because the insulin doesn't get assimilated. I mean, their body doesn't signal to them that they're full because their metabolism is not functioning correctly. Also, these depression drugs can also lead to weight gain. So it's a syndrome. The people get under stress, then they eat too much. Then they get overweight, and then they get depressed, and then they take a depression pill, and then they get more overweight, and then their metabolism screws up. And and so it's just a very self-generating system. The human body is a commodity to exploit for wealth. Just like with social media, the human mind, your ideas, what you care about is exploited for profit. So the first assignment is from page 1 to 68. I will include in my discussion here a couple other later chapters that are also focused on the chemistry. And then for the next class, the focus is on the politics and why it is we don't have any laws to curb the corporate exploitation. There's a whole history behind this in the USA. But let's just do the body chemistry right now. Um, Here we go. Now, the other thing that I found was very fascinating was right in the beginning, in the first few pages. He makes a distinction that's based on Aristotle. And he says Aristotle. Okay, okay. Um, so pleasure is the extreme of too much, is addiction. And happiness, the extreme of too little, is depression. So he says Aristotle makes a distinction between pleasure and happiness. And pleasure is uh, immediate high. Dopamine gets into your system and you feel hot, you feel happy, but then it tanks. And then you need more dopamine. So that's the problem with being impulsive. So if you remember self-control is the mean between extremes. So he's taking this straight out of Aristotle. He doesn't tell you at first. But then Aristotle says, you have to have pleasure. You don't deny yourself pleasure. It's not a puritanical goal. They're not Puritans. They want everything in moderation, which is what I like about the Greeks and which is unlike American culture because we do have a lot of Puritanism. So we tend to have repression of emotions and then release. Okay, so we really tend to go from one extreme to the other in all aspects of our culture. But our founders were very aware of the Greeks and they wanted to set up something that was the virtues, Aristotle's virtues. Thomas Jefferson's house looks like a Greek temple. I wonder why. Anyway, so this is his thesis. He's going to develop separate and parallel scientific, that's what we'll do today, cultural, historical, economic, and social arguments that our minds have been hacked. This hack, our mind is our ability to set long-term goals, to have a good idea of what will make us happy in the long run, and then to live according to that idea. This hack is the systematic confusion and conflation of the concepts of pleasure and happiness and the definitions of pleasure and happiness has been inserted into our limbic system, which is the emotional part of our brains, precipitating a slow motion crash of 25 to 50% of individuals and exacting a severe detrimental impact on our whole society. So this is the metabolic disorder, like the whole system crashes. It doesn't function anymore in any sort of natural way. It was not accidental. It was specifically designed and engineered with a profit motive. And that is exactly what was true of social media. It was not accidental. The corporate CEOs of Facebook said, we're competing for attention and we go deeper into the brainstem. So social media competes for your attention and triggers pleasure and fear. And the food system goes for your body and triggers pleasure, the pleasure that comes from eating, right? And it continues to be executed by private interests with government support. So in other developed countries, they do have laws and they have norms and they don't eat as much sugar as we do. They don't eat as much snacks. They don't eat as much processed food. They don't eat as quickly. They still have meals. We're the country that has been the biggest sucker for all of this. And just American culture in general is hyperactive and not focused on reflective thinking, settling down and thinking, reflecting on life and making decisions that not impulsively. Okay, this imbalance of the limbic system hacks our decision-making capacity. So the part of our brain that makes decision, the mindful part, as Aristotle said, right? Cognition gives way to mind, thinking about thinking. So our ability to think about our thinking or to think about our feelings or to teach ourselves to take pleasure in eating moderately. So it's not that a mindful person takes pleasure in eating mindfully, but the morally strong person really wants to eat sugar, but they have strength and they don't, but they're internally conflicting. The morally weak person knows they shouldn't eat that much sugar, but they do it anyway. And then the self-indulgent person doesn't even know or doesn't care or doesn't think there's anything wrong with it. So, yeah, those same types are very much a part of the food system, but especially sugar. So this man is a pediatric endocrinologist. So he's focused on the endocrine system, which is the metabolic system. And he's focused on children, and he sees these hormone problems in children. My goodness, right? Children should be running outside and playing. Children, Mr. Height, remember? He said children needs to go outside. They need to fall down. They need to have these problems. They need to relate to other people. They sit on their phones. So the other side of this is while they're sitting on their phones, they're eating sugar or processed food. And so their bodies are falling apart, right? Their emotions are falling apart, but their limbic system is also emotions, but different emotions, but still irrational. So the irrational part of the psyche is being absolutely exploited. Take away people's self-control and their mind and make money off of them. Um, he has apparently people in his field are subject to depression a lot because they're always telling their clients to change their habits, that the problem is they have to stop eating sugar, but they don't stop eating sugar because they're addicted. So his book is going to connect all these aspects of reality and of life. So one of the main issues in this class is about health. And it's about how health is not just my physical health. It's all about culture. And so he also knows it's all about culture that gets us sick and keeps us sick. So there's the biochemistry, there's the neuroscience. We know how our brains work. But that knowledge, as I said with Mark Zuckerberg, he donated a lot of money to neuroscience, and then he uses that information to teach 4-year-olds to get addicted to Facebook. So there is a neuroscience behind it that should either stop us from eating this way, or the corporations use it to get us even more hooked. There's genetics, but most of what we do is not genetic, it's called epigenetic. So if we have a genetic propensity for obesity, if we didn't live in a certain culture, if we lived in a culture where it wasn't, the food was healthy and it was normal just to eat healthy, that those genes would probably not activate or not as much. But if you live in a culture where it's constantly being fed and stimulated, your genetic tendency would really not only activate, but it would go berserk and lead to a disorder. The physiology, the medicine, the way the profession works, it doesn't help. The nutrition in our country has been exploited, the psychology and the psychiatry, and that would involve also social media and your social relations. Public health, we don't have enough money and funding for public health the way that other developing countries do. The economics, how does our economic system make this work? And then our philosophy, our theology, our history, and our law. This all fits together to create this incredible hacking and meltdown. So sugar causes a change in your biochemistry, which is a metabolic syndrome, your metabolism. It links, so there is a connection between nutrition and physical health and behavioral health. So if you get triggered, if your metabolism isn't functioning, not only does your physical health go down, but your behavioral health and your, you know, relationships, your self-concept, it all goes down together. Pleasure is a reward pathway in the brain. Okay, this is really important because they're totally different pathways in your brain. Pleasure is the reward, and happiness is contentment. And so this is an Aristotelian distinction, right? This is real happiness. This is not the happiness of last class when Glenn Hedges was talking about the psychologist's view of happiness as pleasing the corporation, right? That was a corrupt view of happiness, Whatever makes the corporation happy makes me happy. This is not that. This is another kind of understanding where Aristotle, this is back to authentic Aristotelian, where you have the end in view, you act in ways that promote that flourishing and the particular way you've set out to flourish. Okay, the separate pathways, this is how they work, and they're regulated entirely differently. So reward is short-lived. Contentment is longer, and you look at how to achieve a goal. Reward is visceral. It appeals to your body's fight or flight system. So, and contentment is calming. So that mean between extreme, sophrosune, is level-headedness. That's a Greek virtue, is sophrosune, means that you don't lose your temper, you don't go to an extreme, you have this idea of human excellence in your mind, and you just act on it constantly. Reward, the substances that trigger this kind of dopamine are drugs, caffeine, alcohol, and sugar. What triggers contentment is achievement. It isn't a physical thing at all. It's where you teach yourself to take pleasure in helping other people, in working together with other people, in creating good laws, good institutions, in doing honorable things that improves the quality of life. All those spiritual goals, the preservation of nature, the the pursuit of truth, science in some sort of way that actually will benefit human flourishing. So we can go back to all those intellectual virtues, but they're always for the sake of the good life for you and everybody else. So, and it's calming. The reward system is yours alone. And the reward system involves taking and winning. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. Contentment is giving. That goes right back to Aristotle. Generosity, magnanimity, equity, the ability to forgive. Reward is yours alone. You win or you lose. And contentment is concerned with others and social well-being. Okay, so that's, again, I said that with Aristotle's virtues over and over. Reward is misery. You go up and down, up and down. Contentment, you're never really miserable. You just are very even keel all the way along. Reward is driven by dopamine. There is a chemical in your brain. And contentment is driven by serotonin. They're totally different brain processes. The reward system leads to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and dementia. Early dementia. So early dementia is like stage 3 diabetes, which means people become disoriented. They have dementia, and then they are in that frame of mind for years and years. Whereas before, when they ate a decent diet, people would live, active lives, and then maybe toward the end, a year or two, they would deteriorate, but not like this. And that costs an incredible amount of money. So what are the problems with studies, right? These studies are done on animals. Is that fair? There's a correlation. We can't say it's directly causal, but it's a clear correlation between dopamine and this kind of behavior. And it's hard to do causative studies on emotions because we reflect on our emotions, right? We don't just have blind emotions. We can think about our emotions. The studies measure blood levels. Is that related to the brain? They're expensive. And there's other neurochemicals that play a role. There's genetic and epigenetic influences, but we haven't been able to have a science of serotonin research on serotonin because the FDA, Congress won't pass funding for it because nobody can make money off of it. So connecting moods and emotions to rational public policy is nuanced and complex. So it's hard, of course, to figure this out. Now, the Garden of Earthly Delights. This is another trend or claim that many of these people make, is that if you remember, Haidt said spirituality is important. He's an atheist, but he said religious communities were people gathering together, exercising virtue, as Aristotle would say. They're exercising the virtues. They're being generous. They're donating time. They're living for the sake of something greater than themselves. And it isn't just praying to God, it's also donating time, donating money. It's physical. There's boots on the ground activism. And that has always been a way to separate pleasure from happiness. Religion has always condemned impulsivity, right? Sexual, especially, right? Sexual infidelity was always a big deal. Drinking has been a big deal for religions. And obesity, not so much because it wasn't an issue in the past, but it's important. Aristotle's happiness meant being an ethical person, living on the basis of reason and virtue, and being content. Zeno, Stoicism, he said, wise people are happy. Unhappiness is caused by errors in judgment. And that's consistent with Aristotle. Epicurus was peace is the absence of fear and pain, and you have lots of friends. So these are friends based on virtue, and it makes you happy, and you don't have internal conflicts. So if you remember, the wise person has integrity. The morally strong person is still internally conflicted. The morally weak person is even more conflicted, and the self-indulgent person just goes on dopamine day and night and is all over the map, can't concentrate at all. Christianity, preached that, okay, you can have all these pleasures after death, but pleasure is the devil on earth. Pain is humility, and service is a way to a happy afterlife, right? So the idea is that if you experience unjust suffering, it's a test of your faith, and you're supposed to accept it or work through it, not try to escape it, not try to resent it, just grow past it. And service is important, helping other people out. So for Aristotle, it's part of flourishing to help other people out. And every aspect of your life, your ambition, what sort of job you do, how you do it, is always serving other people. Whereas in Christianity, it tends to be self-denial. Whereas in the Greek, it's not self-denial, it's self-affirmation. But since the Renaissance, which was the rebirth, supposedly, of the classics, but the kind of humanism that arose said that happiness is the goal of life, but that tended to degenerate into material, into pleasure. Now, the Puritans didn't think so. They thought their view was that success, you repress your pleasures and you pour all that energy into work to make money, business. But modern humanism is different, and it has led to more extremes. So to me, Aristotle's humanism is more like religion. It is very wary of greed, very wary of arrogance, is overstepping your bounds. But modern humanism is use science to exploit nature and have more material well-being. The Puritans didn't want that to be dopamine. They just meant the satisfaction that comes from being successful in the business world. Anyway, pop happiness is positive psychology, so we've already been through that. It's just interesting that these people have clearly read each other's books or some other book that has this collective understanding that positive psychology is pop happiness. It's pleasure rather than contentment. Um, we will talk about Jeremy Bentham when we talk about the Enlightenment. And his principle for behavior was maximizing pleasure. So you act in a way that the majority of people have more pleasure and less pain. Now, his ideas were naturally driven by pleasure and pain, but Bentham then also said there aren't any higher pleasures or lower pleasures. It's as long as you don't harm another person in your pleasures. So people think I can eat as much sugar as I want. I'm not hurting anybody else. But everything is affected. People are affected by other people's behavior. So it does hurt people. It hurts them if it breaks down your relationships because you're too impulsive. It hurts you in the long run because you get sick. And it also hurts you get sick and then you send the bill to the government. So other people have to pay your healthcare bills. Even if you have healthcare through your work, the cost of the healthcare goes up. And everybody at your work who's in your group, your healthcare group, has to pay more. So there's no such thing as behavior that doesn't affect other people. But that was how you were taught to think as an individual who can do whatever they want as long as they don't harm somebody else. So Bentham turned happiness into pleasure, dopamine. Pleasure is gratification or reward, excitement, amusement. It depends on the circumstances, but we've talked about that before. Glenn Hedges talked about that. Excitement, amusement, we're amusing ourselves to death. We're distracting ourselves. Happiness is human flourishing, growth, physical and spiritual. It's not prone to acute changes and it's not related to circumstances. Today's most successful marketing strategies. I did talk about neuromarketing before, and he's bringing it up again, the corporate consumption complex. There's another thing called limbic capitalism, where you tap the limbic system to make money. But this is the same, another name for a very similar phenomenon. The 6 biggest industries are hedonistic, which is dopamine, pleasure, tobacco, alcohol, food. And the other 3 are behavioral triggers, things that trigger you, like guns, cars, and energy, I guess. I'm not quite sure. Aggression, I suppose that's what that's about. There's a constant improving in techniques in marketing based on neuroscience. Mr. Mate points that out, neuromarketing. It's becoming a bigger and bigger deal. Okay. So how is it that we've messed up with our brains? Many brain connections are made before we're born. Aggression, passivity. And this I know from personal experience because I had 3 kids. And the first one is the most aggressive, or was before she was born. She still, I think, is the most extroverted. The second one I thought was dead because he wasn't moving the way the first one was. But he wasn't dead. He's fine. And he's been a quiet person ever since. He's introverted. And then the third one was in between. And by the time she was in sixth grade, she said, Mom, I think I'm in between Rachel and Carl's. Like, yes, you are. But that's how genetic it is. That's how there is a genetic orientation that occurs before you're born. There's maternal behavior, like I didn't drink. You're not supposed to drink anything. I didn't. I think I ate sugar those days, especially with the third one, and I was not having trouble getting sleep because I had two other kids. I think I drank more coffee and ate more sugar, but I'm not sure. Um, I know I ate a lot of tuna. I ate a ton of protein when I was pregnant, partly because it's brain food. So I would eat a whole can of tuna for lunch. Um, and I did. It was interesting because my body was self-regulating. I craved milk. I craved protein. I really didn't want, my body really didn't want sugar. So it was the first time in my life that I wasn't a chocoholic. Um, it was interesting, I remember thinking, wow, like my body really wants me to be healthy here and take care of this baby. So the other things, sexual orientation, biochemistry is the cause. All right. So he's on page 27. He says, you see the results, I see the cause. So um, I've put in here that the cause that I see, he's looking at the chemistry. I'm looking at the ideas that led to the culture that allows for this kind of triggering of body chemistry, the politics and economics. And he does go into that next, in the second reading. But this one, I think that these are ideas we'll talk about later on. Freedom. The cause behind all of this is the idea that democracy means everyone's free to live as they like. That's Jeremy Bentham. That's exactly what happened in Athens. And the Republic Book 8 talks about that. Freedom means freedom license. And then Aristotle, in his Politics, says that a corrupt democracy is one that where people think freedom means license to live as you like. And those kinds of democracies lead to distraction, impulsivity, and also especially to debt. A lot of middle class people just go into debt and then they become unstable and resentful. And then if a ambitious political leader says, it's all the rich people's fault, and if you elect me, I will take their money and give it to you, right? The Rise of a Dictator. That's in Republic Book 8 to 9. And that's also Aristotle talks about that. Um, Capitalism, the notion that greed is good. People believe this. It's part of our ideas, our cultural ideas. Nobody else believes this. The Greeks said, no, greed is not good. And you should have a humane economic system that promotes moderation, that has laws that promote a middle class, that has a very high inheritance tax so that the children of rich people cannot inherit money and develop an entirely detached rich class and oligarchy. Um, the dualism of our culture is Puritanism, where we deny, repress, or condemn the body and its desires. And so we fluctuate between self-indulgence and guilt, and neither one of those is healthy. The Greeks really wanted something entirely different that's neither too much nor too little and isn't motivated by guilt, it's motivated by pleasure. You are happy because you know you have control. The purpose of science is to exploit nature for human well-being, for human happiness, however people define it. That's another Enlightenment Western idea. God ordained that Europeans would discover America and exploit its resources for European well-being and prosperity. That's another deep-seated belief of colonialism. knowledge of the land and how to live sustainably of the Native Americans was worthless, according to the Europeans who came over, the British. God wanted um, the Native Americans to be removed by force to make the way for progress. If the Native Americans resist Europeans setting up homesteads and taking over their land, then God would want them to be killed. A mechanistic model for the economy is the best way to understand our economic lives and create a system where people buy what they want and most efficiently, and this will make them happy. So the best system for an economy is calculating the most efficient means to your own economic well-being. It's exactly the opposite of an Aristotelian humanistic economic system where people are raised to want to be moderate and they will set up an economy that's constantly redistributing wealth so that you have a middle class. Another belief behind all this is the government should not regulate business because they will do it according to the donations of their political donors and supporters. And okay, so the government shouldn't regulate business. And God wants Europeans to colonize the world, to take the natural resources and make them into marketable products and sell them back. Because this is the way to prosperity and a higher standard of living for everyone. And God gave us the earth to do this, and thank God for Europeans, they actually could do it. That's what I think are the ideas behind all of this, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the Enlightenment. But he's talking about the systems of the brain chemistry behind the behavior. So the reward system is dopamine, contentment pathway is serotonin. And another problem is the stress, fear, memory pathway. The amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus is a pathway. And I personally have had years in my life when I was triggered, and that's a pathway. I know it's cortisol. I've been there. And when you are panicked, because you're afraid of something, you're phobic about something, and it's when you're under a lot of stress, you do go back into the past and you it drives your memory back. So I think when a lot of people are stressed by some current changes in front of them and they panic, they're afraid of change, then their memories will go back to some good old days. That's why politicians can say, I'm going to make America great again like it was in the good old days, is their way to break out of that fear and to develop some fantasy memory of the past. It's very powerful. There's a brain chemistry to it. That's why you have to break the pathway, which I have conscientiously been doing for the last year or two. It takes practice and it takes diligence. The prefrontal cortex, this is a part of your brain that can regulate your impulses, but it can be connected to dopamine, serotonin, or in cortisol. And everyone has different on-ramps and off-ramps. So different external stimuli that either connect to dopamine, to serotonin, or to cortisol. So there's things that when I was in a panicked frame of mind, various things, I would get in situations or I would go to certain locations and they would trigger cortisol, my panic, because of all the memories I had about unpleasant experiences. And I just had to put myself in different situations. Other ones, people will have an experience. I understand the phenomenon of comfort foods. People might remember their childhood and eating certain things made them so happy and grandma used to make. And oftentimes that's food that is not good for you. Grandma made desserts and sugar, and it was this great memory of eating something with sugar in it with grandma. And so it's just harder to regulate your dopamine. And then serotonin, again, you can have this image of the well-lived life. You can have this image of practical wisdom as a person who has sofrosune, and then you persist in that image. There's an obesity drug. So at first, one of the earlier ones was you didn't get any pleasure from eating, but you didn't get pleasure from anything. And so people were getting depressed and suicidal. So the more recent ones don't work that way. I'm not sure how the chemistry behind them, but yeah, I mean, obesity drugs are becoming a huge deal. And the big issue is, should Medicare pay for it, which again will blow up our national debt? Should private sector companies pay for it when employers are on a group, an institution is on a healthcare? Should they offer this? It's, everybody wants it. It costs a lot of money. But you don't do anything to prevent it. You don't do anything to prevent the obesity. All you do is make money fixing it, which isn't really fixing it. I mean, the best way to fix it is to eat right and exercise. Get your body back to where it should be. So we do need some reward to prevent anxiety because life is fearful. There are all these threats. So we have to have rewards. We have to have ability to laugh, ability to get out there and have fun and reward ourselves. But we're just, when you keep rewarding yourself until you get in debt, and then all of a sudden you're even more anxious than ever, which happens with that happiness science, pop psychology. Love. How does porn fit in? Remember, we talked about porn. Eros versus philia, which is long-term friendship bonds. Long-term is connected to the community and cognitive learning. That's what I said, that sex should be tied to contentment. So that's a standard thing about couples, that they fall in love. It's all, eros, it's all sex reward. But when the marriage really works, it settles down into a friendship and a long-term friendship. And it's not an addiction. It's a long-term commitment. It's not an infatuation. So infatuation is obsessive and there's no serotonin, right? It's not long-term. Desire versus mature love, which allows for social growth and cognition. So you can tie your sexual pleasure and desire to living a full life, with sharing your life with a person and growing together. I mean, it sounds kind of quaint and sort of, what is it, cliche, but that's just the way it is. I don't know how else to describe it. The mediator of love between a mother and her children is totally different. It's oxytocin. It works through a different emotional pathway, unrelated to the other three. So I think that's interesting because I did have a child when I was 21, and that's what motivated me. Everything I did in philosophy is, what is it I think I can do best to make the world the best place possible for my children to live in? And now that's my main motivation for not retiring, for staying active, is I want to do what I think I can do to make the world for my grandchildren better. And I can't think of it any other way. I just don't think about dopamine and serotonin very much. I just think about oxytocin and cortisol. I've had to get over that. um, because love is powerful. But the other thing about it, if you're nurturing a little baby, you can also get scared because the baby um, is vulnerable. And so mothers not only love their babies, but they are very alert to all the possible dangers. And so um, cortisol can kick in, but they can't function simultaneously. So the mother is either totally thinking about her love or she's totally freaking out about her fears. Um, so that's interesting. It's interesting to me because I didn't care about body chemistry. I just, I just cared about that model of happiness, trying to live that way. But when I learned about the chemistry, it sort of helped me figure out what's going on in my body and also control it, like stop the cortisol rather than start listing all the things to be panicked about, which I could do and drive myself crazy. Uh, okay, what about desire and dopamine, pleasure, opioids? Um, Reward is wired into us. Society provides rewards, right? That's what social media is obsessed with. Teenagers getting rewards from their friends. Um, but when it comes to the primary goal, just getting outside approval, then it leads to unhappiness. Um, so opioids are, incredibly powerful because they're based on neuroscience, a much more sophisticated understanding of body chemistry, and they were able to tap into that. Um, okay, so there's a part of the brain we don't have any control over. And that's different. The Enlightenment thinkers thought there was no such thing, but there is. It's very primitive. And so the Enlightenment thinkers thought we could socially engineer people not to have a primitive reaction to anything, not to have the emotions or the actions driven by primitive drives. And they were wrong, and it's pretty obvious. So we'll talk about that more later. But the best way to not allow the primitive brain to take control is to constantly seek the mean. So obesity ruins the dopamine system. So this is really bad news because the heavier you get, um, the more stress you get. I mean, you have stress and you eat, and then you get obese and it gives you more stress. And then your body produces leptin, which extinguishes the dopamine signal. So, in obese people, your neurons are immune to leptin, so you don't get this dopamine rush. So you eat more to get a dopamine high. So when people are addicted, they need more and more of the drug to get the same high. That's the same with sugar. Um, and because it extinguishes the dopamine signal, um, obese people, their bodies don't tell them that they're full. They don't tell them when they're full. And so then they just want to eat more. It's terrible. Drugs can help with schizophrenia, but there's huge side effects, and it's used to stabilize children's moods, ADHD, but it leads to obesity. Again, all these so-called diagnosed, that's what Mr. Mate is very much against. This huge book of the American Psychological Association puts out about all these disorders, right? ADHD, ADD, depression. And he thinks so much of that imbalance is a function of toxic culture. It's a function of it, it's a feature of it. We set people up to get these imbalances, and then we make money creating these imbalances, and then we make money trying to fix them. So again, if a kid is on social media from age 4, obviously they're going to get ADHD or attention deficit disorder. My gosh. they're not even getting wired to know what it means to pay attention. It's just, it should be so obvious um, that the people roaming around look like people, that their brains are functioning so differently, unlike we were evolved to operate. Like people have messed with their brains in a way that's unlike ever before in human history, which is really weird. But we still can learn from Aristotle because it messes with you in a way that taps into these very old drives so we can identify that problem. But um, all right, so there are all these drugs to transport dopamine, to deactivate dopamine, to raise dopamine. Obviously, we've got a dopamine problem. Um, and EOPs consummate the pleasurable experience. The body can adjust, but then it needs more. So chronic stress impacts our dopamine more than anything else. So Mr. Mate said we have a toxic culture because people live with stress, and then that impacts dopamine, and then you have metabolic disorder, and oh, you know, it's a downward spiral. What about cortisol? So stress, fear, and cortisol. So cortisol is good in moderation if you know how to fear appropriately. So courage, right? Knowing what to fear for the right reason in the right way. But if you have severe stress, you're afraid all the time because you're under so much pressure. And eventually it can kill you. Long-term exposure will kill you slowly. When pressures are relentless, your cortisol response can remain elevated for days, months, or years. Evidence of the associations between job stress, psychological distress, elevated cortisol, depression, and disease is very compelling. I know people who have been through that, and the ones I know have one of the hardest jobs ever, which is executive director of inner city schools, trying to educate the underclass because the stresses are unbelievable. The requirements from the government, the staff and faculty are also under so much stress. The kids are acting out because they get fed the wrong foods because sugar and processed food is cheaper. Plus, they live in neighborhoods that are scary. So the kids are between dopamine and cortisol. It's really hard for them to sit still, to listen. It's not that they deliberately don't like the teachers, they're just under all these other stresses. Um, it can also speed up the onset of dementia. The people with the most stress and the most diabetes, stroke, heart disease are middle and lower class. And then they're the people who can't afford healthy food. The amygdala responds to threats. You need to tame it. If it overreacts, you have SMS, cortisol, hypertension, stroke. And again, that's tied to memories. So it's very hard to get yourself out of a syndrome where you get paranoid, right? You get in situations that remind you of a cortisol overreaction, and it's hard to stop it. An excess of cortisol kills brain stems that normally shouldn't die. It impacts our ability to reason. Too much cortisol, you overreact to everything. And if you want dopamine to relieve the stress, then you get that other problem. Sugar is a drug of choice to relieve stress. Stress leads to more cortisol. Cortisol kills neurons that help inhibit food intake, leading to more eating, right? Oh my gosh. So you have stress, you have cortisol, then you want sugar, then that kills neurons that tell you when you're full. So then you don't get the signal that tells you when you're full. So you eat more and you get fatter, get more obese, and get more stress. Sleep deprivation, it also tends to lead to eating more and making it harder to sleep. Adverse childhood experiences change the brain and predispose people to adult obesity. And we have so many toxic environments where children are growing up. They're not just poor, they're violent. Okay, so I lived in Indonesia and I've seen a lot of poor people we would call poor, but the kids are totally happy. Kids sleep with their parents for 4 years. They're completely secure, completely happy. The kids I saw just sat and played all day and their moms hung out together, right? It's completely no stress life. They had enough food. They lived in houses where, these houses right next to each other in ghettos, in basically Indonesian ghettos, but they're happy. They have a low stress life. Um, okay, so the descent into Hades, the goal is the optimum level of dopamine receptors. This is where I want a dopamine high all the time, and it just really kills your body. The good cells die, so they can't turn bad, cancer, or you die from poisoning from outside, or you self-destruct. Um, so it's just a downward spiral. The toleration, the downregulation of receptors with a chance of coming back. But if you try to keep stimulating with dopamine, you kill the neuron. Um, if you stop, the dopamine receptors can regenerate, but it takes at least 12 months, so you have to stop. Snowball, withdrawal, physical and emotion. Addiction can happen to anybody. That's important to know. Um, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, they changed their definition of addictive behaviors. So it doesn't have to include withdrawal symptoms. It can also include all sorts of disruptions to all aspects of life. Certain genes predispose people to addiction, but everyone has a dopamine system, and dopamine drives addiction, not the other way around. Addiction transfer, people who get stomach surgery become alcoholics because they're trying to lose weight. So now they get addicted to alcohol because they can't be addicted to sugar anymore. Coca-Cola was invented by a man addicted to morphine, and Coca-Cola has cocaine, alcohol, caffeine, and sugar, and it's sold in a drugstore. All right, so then in the temperance movement, you had to remove the alcohol, but he removed the cocaine, but it was still addictive because everybody's still addicted to the caffeine and the sugar in Coke. And now today it's cash crops in developing nations. Coca-Cola is big. Um, okay, the purification of addiction, the history of alcoholism, it wasn't a problem until it became cheap and available. Um, it became legal at the beginning of the Great Depression because the government needed the tax money to pay for social programs. I think that's really interesting. Um, Today, binge drinking is a big problem. Alcoholism is a big problem. Marijuana, cocaine, medications now used offline as cognitive enhancers. Why can't people just learn how to balance their psyches without some external, right? Some chemical added to their brain? They need to control their brain chemistry. The processed food is just horrible. It's a cheap thrill. It has a huge profit margin. Refined sugar is the drug of abuse. High fructose corn syrup competed against cane and beet sugar. So when we started using corn syrup, the prices went down. Um, and then you had these dietary goals, which just said eat less fat, but it didn't say anything about sugar. So a lot of products that were low fat had more sugar. So, at, and there are healthy fats. So, body's essential nutrients, none of them are remotely addictive. So, if you ate what you're supposed to eat, you wouldn't have problems with addiction. Alcohol fries your brain and your liver. Sugar fries your liver. Refined sugar is a drug. Children get the diseases of alcohol and type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease without even ever imbibing alcohol. Addiction, there's a tolerance based on tolerance and dependence. People need more and more, and they're miserable without it. Contentment and serotonin. This is about depression and antidepressants, how they work, the side effects. There's a section on that. Okay. It's hard to maximize serotonin and live a contented life because the body tends to metabolize as much as you would normally eat. Corn-fed beef leads to liver fat. So it really matters what the animals are being fed for how your body deals with it. Corn-fed beef and chicken is not natural, and it leads to liver fat. Whereas in beef grass-fed makes a complete difference. I didn't know that. I just have been a vegetarian for 20 plus years, so it's not an issue. Okay, so if you have liver fat, it causes a metabolic syndrome because insulin doesn't clear the glucose from the blood, and so the fat precipitates in your liver, and this processed food is directly connected to these kind of metabolic disorders. Low-fat foods have more sugar, leads to more metabolic disorders, leads to depression. With metabolic disorder, the chronic insulin in the brain blocks the signal to stop eating, so you end up eating more. You're hungrier than ever. The teenagers who have metabolic syndrome have cognitive decline, brain shrinkage, decreased white matter, and integrity. So I have been talking about that a lot, right? The white matter is closest to your brain. You can have brain scans that show the white matter is shrinking or it's not even developing because that's the reflective part of your brain. That's where you think about your emotions or you think about how you're thinking. Okay, so your gut microbiome is getting all messed up from this messed up food, cognitive decline. It really matters what kind of fish you eat. If it's fish food, fake food, it doesn't have the omega-3 that it should have. And that's enough of that. And so that's the brain chemistry, which is really sad, that on sugar alone, we can completely mess up our brains for life and really make ourselves very unhappy. We can fail to achieve our goals because we acted too impulsively. We can break down our relationships because we get too angry or too controlling or whatever. And so I would recommend to students to take this seriously because you can't fight your brain, your body chemistry. And the system is really set up to exploit you. So take a deep breath and think about that. If you are a healthcare provider, I would recommend that you give your patients a copy of the book or a copy of the outline, give them the cheat sheet, and just tell them they should really think about this. He doesn't even mention exercise, which again is a big deal because people didn't used to sit all day. That's totally unnatural. the sedentary nature of our society where people sit all day in their jobs. Our bodies are not wired for that. We're supposed to be moving, right? Physical movement. We used to have to work. Work meant physical work. So exercise is also a really big deal. And we can get so far away from where we should be. It's just frightening. So that's the lecture for today. And I hope you have things to write in your post about it. You can think of examples. You can think of what you like to do as a healthcare provider to set a role model and to advise your patients or clients or whatever.